Okay, hello everyone again. We're going to start our next session on connecting the dots between climate goals and fossil fuel producers. I'm going to introduce the panel, and I'm not going in between the four of you. I also should say that this panel is unfortunately leaving a lot to be desired in terms of gender diversity. But they are going to make up for it. They are going to make up for it by the extreme diversity of their ideas and presentations. And I'm going to help them by waiving the cards with their time budget and making sure that they don't overshoot it. So our first speaker will be Greg Muttitt from the All Change International, where Greg is research director. And many of you, of course, know his work, Sky's the Limit. Then we will have Andrew Grant, who is a senior analyst with Carbon Tracker Initiative, and followed by Rick Heede, director and co-founder, Climate Accountability Institute, and concluding with a presentation from Yonatan Strauch, who is PhD candidate at the Energy Pole at the University of Waterloo in Canada. So welcome, and I'm giving the floor to Greg straight away, and the microphone.
Thank you, Ivetta. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm really enjoying the second conference on fossil fuel supply and climate change. I hope you all are too. At the first conference 2 years ago, I presented a new report. It was called, I'll show you here, The Sky's Limit, Why the Paris Climate Goals Require a Managed Decline of Fossil Fuel Production. Since we published that, we've applied its findings to particular countries, to particular sectors. And we're also starting to dig a bit more into the original numbers, and that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. I just want to repeat the plea from the previous section that it's so rare to get something from the politicians that we don't water it down by talking about 2 degrees, that we focus on the Paris goals of keeping warming well below 2 degrees and pursuing efforts to keep warming to 1.5 degrees. Now, we've heard several times today about the studies that have compared global fossil fuel reserves with carbon budgets. There was, of course, the famous study in 2009 by Malte Meinshausen, the fantastic work that Carbon Tracker and Bill McKibben did to follow that up, and even earlier studies going back to Bill Hare in the 1990s. Those studies have consistently found that we have much more fossil fuels reserves than we can afford to burn, several times as much. Now, our study here is in that tradition, comparing fossil fuel reserves with carbon budgets. But what we've done is we've focused on a particular category of reserves, which is those which are already in fields and mines which are in operation, where everything's been built and where the capital has been invested. I'll show you our finding here. That's in the left-hand column, the developed reserves in already producing oil fields, gas fields, and coal mines. And as you can see, it massively exceeds the carbon budget for staying within 1.5 degrees. It significantly exceeds the budget for 2 degrees. Now, any new field or mine that gets developed will add to that left-hand column. And logically, that can do one of 2 things. Either it pushes the world further beyond climate limits, or ultimately, a good chunk of what's in the left-hand column doesn't get burned or doesn't get extracted, and we have a lot of stranded assets. We have a lot, because that reflects already invested capital. Our conclusion from this study is that we need to stop developing new fossil fuel extraction projects, new fields and mines. When you're in a hole, you need to stop digging. But a question we've been asked since then is, Why is this conclusion different from what some of the other models say? Why is it different from what the International Energy Agency says or some of the IPCC models? Now, a first difference is a structural one. Many of those other models, this is a simplification, of course. This is a static version just for oil. Many of those other models are economic optimizing models. They focus on the least cost resources. And the way they work is by assuming that climate policy will restrict demand to a certain level. The restricted demand will push down the price, in this case of oil. You can mark that somewhere on your graph. And then what happens is, I don't know how to use a laser pointer here. No? Ah, yes. What happens then is this stuff to the right, this all becomes unviable, while what's to the left is competitive. And since some of these grey ones here have already been developed, well, they lose all their money. But then there's room for some new development here with the red ones, which happen to be cheaper. Now, we take a different approach from that. And the reason we do is because of the problem of lock-in. Now, what happens when there is a reduction in the oil price, whether it's driven by climate policy or by something else, we know what happens when there's a reduction in the oil price. We've seen it very recently in the last few years. After 2014, the fossil fuel producers went cap in hand to governments, asking for support in the very difficult environment that they experienced. It happened here in the UK. In the government budgets in 2015 and 2016, we saw the largest tax breaks given to the North Sea oil industry in a generation, including adjusting the rate of petroleum revenue tax to 0%. At the same time, the big oil companies or the big fossil fuel companies sell their assets to smaller companies that can sweat those assets better. They cut costs. They often cut corners on safety. And so what you see is that these things, which in a cost-optimizing model ought to become unviable, in fact, they all move left. And so we get a crowding to the left, and we get too much production and too much emissions. Now, how else are we different from some other models? Well, there are some assumptions in the heart of models which are very important to what conclusion comes out at the end, and I'm going to highlight three of them. The first is, if you phase out coal fast enough, some people argue, you can make more room for new gas or new oil. Secondly, what is the level of climate ambition you're applying? I've mentioned that already. Thirdly, what happens to negative emissions? And then at the end of this, I'm just going to briefly refer to the debates at the moment about how big are carbon budgets. Now, this is the column from the original graph, which I showed you before, and I'm comparing it with what happens in the IEA's climate scenarios. Now, the first thing you see is that they assume not all the coal will get extracted from the existing mines, which is fair enough, and I'm going to come back to that point. They also assume a smaller amount of non-energy emissions. But when you bring back these IPCC carbon budgets from the fifth assessment report, you find there's still too much, even in the IEA's assumptions on coal and non-energy emissions. And the reason the IEA is able to say, well, there's still room for new development, is because they're using larger carbon budgets. I'm picking on the IEA here, by the way. I could equally have said this about many of the, not all, but many of the IPCC scenarios. So until 2016, the IEA relied on a 50% probability of keeping warming below 2 degrees, hence a larger carbon budget, and there's still room for new development here. They recognized, though, that that wasn't aligned with the Paris goals. So in 2017, they moved to a temperature target of 1.7 to 1.8 degrees here, but then they assumed there can be a lot of negative emissions on top of that, which will suck the carbon back out of the atmosphere. So fortunately, we've still got room for new development. Now, this is the IPCC's graph comparing its climate scenario here with various IPCC scenarios that lead to 1.7 or 1.8 degrees, and you can see a large amount of negative emissions here. Now, what you have to assume to count on that amount of negative emissions, you have to assume that in a couple of decades' time or in a few decades' time, a vast infrastructure will be built to transport carbon dioxide. many times the size of the current natural gas infrastructure. You have to assume that a land area will be devoted to bioenergy, equivalent to up to half of the world's current cropland. You have to assume that this is going to be very well regulated, because bioenergy grown in the wrong place or in the wrong way is not carbon neutral, and CO2 stored in the wrong place might leak out. So you've got to have a good monitoring and regulatory system. You've got to incentivize all this. You've got to fund it. These technologies haven't been tried yet in practice, only in models, so we don't know how much they'll cost. So, you know, I'm not saying it's impossible. But do you want to bet on this? Given that if we get to the stage, perhaps in 30 or 40 years' time, where all of this is proving a bit too difficult, at that stage it won't be reversible because the emissions will have happened. So this is the original slide again, which I showed you before, and I'm going to just show you quickly a couple of the other assumptions and how they change things here. Now, the first thing, I mentioned before that the IEA suggests, well, maybe all this coal won't get extracted, and that is a heck of a lot of coal there in already developed mines. And a difference between coal and oil and gas is that oil and gas are much more capital intensive. So the lock-in effects could be much greater for oil and gas than they are for coal. Conversely, of course, the flip side of that is that coal employs more people, so it raises significant just transition impacts. Now, in this next slide, I've taken a very ambitious assumption on a rapid coal phase-out. What happens if we phase out all of the world's coal production in OECD countries by 2030, in non-OECD countries by 2050? And that's on a straight line starting now. Even then, combined with the developed reserves of oil and gas, we've still got far too much. So the next thing I'm going to look at is, as was mentioned in the previous session, and as you'll have heard, there is some debate at the moment about how big are carbon budgets really, especially since a paper by Richard Miller and colleagues a year ago. Now, that debate has involved a proposed change in methodology to how carbon budgets are calculated, and I don't think that debate is anywhere near resolved yet. I'm still hearing scientists arguing it on both sides. However, let's assume that the Miller et al. Budgets are right, and as Mark mentioned in the previous session, they're likely to be repeated in the IPCC special report, very similar to the way Miller et al. Put them. So in this case, we've kept the rapid coal phase-out assumption, oil and gas as they were before. We've got these larger carbon budgets for 1.5 and 2. And even in this case, the developed reserves are still too large for 1.5. And so you have room for new development only if you abandon the 1.5 target, carbon budgets turn out in the best way possible, you have a rapid phase-out of coal. Ideally, you have low amounts of non-energy emissions, and the other thing that could do it is an assumption on very large negative emissions. To conclude, the assumptions that get put into any model have a significant impact on the model. I've tried to show you on the outcome from that model. I've tried to show you a bit about what happens under the hood of our approach. When I look at these things, I see that at least 4 out of these 5 have to go very well. That leaves me in order to make room for new development of oil and gas. That leads me to the conclusion that governments need to stop issuing licenses, leases, and permits for new fossil fuel extraction or transportation infrastructure. Again, when you're in a hole, stop digging. And instead, governments need to begin now in enabling a managed decline of fossil fuel production and a just transition for workers and communities. Thanks ever so much.
Perfect. Hello everyone, I'm Andrew Grant. I'm a senior analyst at the Carbon Tracker Initiative. I think most of you are probably familiar with the Carbon Tracker Initiative, and it's certainly been great to see some of our charts appearing in a lot of the presentations so far today. So we're a non-profit, philanthropically funded think tank that looks at the issues around climate change, the energy sector and finance, with the central idea of mobilising shareholders, investors, the financial community to put pressure on corporates and hopefully drive us in some way towards an energy system that's aligned with what we're all after here. And what I'm going to do is give you a quick introduction to a bit of work that we put out a couple of months ago in July called 2 Degrees of Separation, which is itself an update of a paper from a year ago, the idea of which is to look at allocating stranded asset risk at the company level. So in other words, which companies have the highest risk of wasting capital on projects that eventually won't prove to be economic, and what the scale of the risk is between those different companies. So firstly, just a little bit of context. We think that the fossil fuel industries, in common with many other industries, are characterized by real information asymmetry between the corporates and those investors that put money into them. In other words, the corporates know exactly which projects are in their sort of development funnel, whereabouts they are. They know the cost of those projects to the dollar or the cent, whereas shareholders might only have a very general view of what those important factors are. So what we look to do is try and bring a bit of transparency into proceedings, kind of along the same lines as the TCFD, and thereby, by looking at the entire fossil fuel industry on a hopefully pretty much consistent basis, try and give shareholders the information they need in order to have constructive dialogue with these companies to really provide the data that powers those conversations and hopefully take them on to the next level. So, do you know, I'll just skip over this, there's a lot of text here. So pretty much this is really a continuation of Carbon Tracker's the trajectory of research over the last few years, which has been to try and keep things as simple as possible, just do a comparison of supply with a simple comparison of demand. So for demand, we do use the IEA scenarios, and Greg has saved me a lot of time by doing all my caveats ahead of time. So here we include 2 of their low carbon scenarios. There's a 2-degree scenario from the World Energy Outlook, and newly a 1.75 degree scenario that's from the ETP. So hopefully slightly more consistent with the Paris objectives for well below 2 degrees. But of course, those both include a certain amount of, for example, negative emissions, other, of course, assumptions, and even then only a 50% chance of likelihood. And to those demand scenarios, we then compare the world of potential supply using the device of a cost curve, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. So that's cost, break-even cost on the right-hand side, on the vertical y-axis, and then that kind of smooth-looking line, which is actually thousands of individual projects lined up in cumulative order by cost. So you've got the lower cost, higher margin, lower risk projects at the bottom left, and the higher cost, higher risk projects at the top right. So those are the ones that only go ahead in sort of more catastrophic climate scenarios, and then as you move down through higher ambition scenarios, you therefore incur less and less from those different projects. So also new that we've included here in the development of our work is using the IEA central scenario, their new policy scenario, as a sort of business as usual benchmark, having previously just included the contents of what was in the database, which was informed by the mind of industry because it's an oil and gas industry database. But by using the IEA's 2.7 degree aligned MPS scenario, what we're really trying to do is really link it to a sort of firm, concrete, well, firmish proxy for the mind of industry for the following reasons. So firstly, was a bit of feedback that we had from the first iteration we did, whereby investors said, well, look, we're taking your information to companies, and they're just telling us, well, look, don't worry about those projects. They're kind of a little way off in the future. We're not going to sanction them for the time being. Admittedly, this was a year ago, and the industry's got slightly more bullish since then. So there's that one. And the second one is to try and strengthen the hand of the companies engaged in them by linking explicitly to what the companies themselves think. So though the MPS is the IEA's, the IEA's scenario, the way it works is it's based on assuming no future climate policy developments aside from those already announced, already enacted. The industry actually, the oil and gas industry tends to believe pretty much the same thing. So a lot of them just use NPS off the bat. Some others who have their own demand scenarios have said that their demand scenarios are kind of similar to the new policy. So for example, Chevron did that in their recent climate report. So the argument as we see it is such that, therefore, if the industry is saying it believes in new policies, it then can't say, okay, we're not going to sanction these projects because it believes in new policies, then presumably it must do. They must believe at some point those projects will be going ahead. So what we're doing is making the numbers slightly more conservative. We're not saying ignore these numbers, these projects here, that oil and gas is still in the ground, don't forget about it. But by becoming slightly more conservative, we're trying to sort of strengthen the hand of those investors that are doing the engagements. So that's the thinking behind the latest report at the company level, and I'll come back to that again shortly. But another important distinction with some of the recent work that you've seen, for example, Greg's, which you went over previously, is that we take a slightly different approach. We don't just look at the quantum of reserves. The quantum of reserves certainly is important for telling the story that there is out there far more oil, gas and coal than we can burn for a good climate outcome. I don't think that's controversial anymore. Mother Nature's given us ourselves enough rope to hang ourselves with. However, when you look at investment patterns, we think you need to include the element of time and the rate of production, not just the quantum of that oil and gas that's there. So using the IEA scenarios, which, as discussed, may be optimistic, but they're the ones that we have. 2-degree scenario is this light blue one. Oil demand falls at about 1% a year-ish, bit over. The dark blue line is the IEA's 1.75 scenario, which is more like a 2% a year decline. However, with the supply of oil and indeed natural gas or fossil gas, the rate at which you get it out of the ground is determined by the amount of sort of subsurface energy in your reservoir. As soon as you start drilling into it, you're losing that subsurface energy, which means that your rate of production starts declining, absent further investment or new fields being started. So here we've used the notional decline rate of about 5%. Estimates vary depending on all sorts of different factors. But because the rate of decline of supply is less than the rate of decline of demand, even in a climate-friendly scenario, you have this gap between the two, which allows for some new supply of oil and gas. That's not true for coal, incidentally. For coal, the message is really quite simple. There's just no more space for new coal. But for oil and gas, we think the picture's a little bit more nuanced and more tricky, more of an intellectual exercise, but kind of more difficult for oil and gas companies to get their heads around. There's potentially some space for new oil and gas production. They don't necessarily know which ones. They don't know if it's theirs or if it's someone else's. So this is really where we think our work comes in, giving shareholders that information to put pressure on companies to be conservative with what they're trying to do, to try and argue against going ahead with certain projects. And why should shareholders care? Because the dollars involved are very, very material. So in the new policy scenario, which is this the 2.75 degree scenario, the BAU scenario, the investment dollars are about 5 trillion. Go down to 2 degrees, that's another trillion of capital there to be wasted. If you go down to 1.75 degrees, that's nearly another trillion again, 0.7 trillion. So the gap in potential capex dollars there to be wasted by poor investment is really very high indeed. Not only that, it's virtually all oil and gas. No doubt coal is the biggest enemy for the climate with its carbon intensity, but over 90% of capital is associated with oil and gas. So oil is the dark blue, gas is the light blue, coal you can probably barely even see, it's this sort of sliver at the top, over 90% oil and gas. And also that's disproportionately in private sector hands. So although reserves are mostly owned by governments, because the private sector tends to disproportionately hold the expensive stuff, and also because they tend to produce their reserves more quickly, again coming back to the rate, when you're looking at over time and potential production in a certain period, you find that the private sector is much more overrepresented. Okay, so just to come on to, that's the big picture. Just to conclude with the results of the scenario, the company level work we've done. Full picture, we look at 70 odd oil and gas companies, just looking at the upstream. Full results are captured in the report on the website, which I would of course encourage you to go and see, talking my own book. But what we find is a real variation between individual companies as to which companies have investment plans or investment options that pretty much fit within even a 2-degree budget. So for example, Saudi Aramco, if you're looking at costs, probably not a huge shock that they come out quite well, famously very, very low cost oil reserves. At the other end, this is organised in quartiles if you're wondering why the ranking looks a bit confusing. At the top end, that some companies have more like a majority of their potential projects available to them outside a 2-degree budget. So the way that management behaves from now on is critically important. In the year since the last update we've done, a certain amount has changed, probably to be not a great shock given what's happened in the industry over the time. Years worth of M&A, new visions to projects, so on and so forth, industry trends, cost inflation, deflation, and so forth. But we go on to that in greater detail in the report. And again, so the report covers the high level. For those of you that have got Bloomberg terminals, I'd recommend looking at our app, Abstract, and then go. And if anyone here is a signatory to or is part of an institution that's part of the UN PRI, there's also a website, 2degreeseparation.com, that you can go on, that gives then a lot more information about those individual companies and the individual projects which they have crucially, so you can see the full extent of their potential capital at risk, and also further detail on those sort of individual projects that can be challenged. And with that, I'll pass over. Thank you very much.
I just want to update you a little bit on what many of you have heard of before, the carbon majors project that assigns and traces emissions from not only supply chain Scope 1 emissions, but also from Scope 3 product-related emissions to individual corporations in the context today of climate litigation. And I just want to take you back to my early reading on climate change, starting with, for example, the MIT study of man's impact on climate. That informed my early thinking on climate change as a major issue in the years ahead. That was in the mid-70s. I ended up doing a thesis work on the geography of presumed recoverable carbon resources, enormous resources, as Andrew and Greg referred to, 4,000 trillion tons of recoverable carbon across all fossil fuel reserves. But that was focused on the national distribution, the geographic distribution, irrespective of the corporations that own those recoverable reserves. Now, these, by and large, are recoverable geologic reserves, not what's defined as corporate recoverable reserves. But I slowly gained an understanding that in order to address this issue, we needed to look at the corporations themselves and what kind of assets they had that imperiled the future of climate change. I worked for a number of years with Amory Lovins on soft energy paths, on demand reduction and fossil fuel efficiency. But we see today that the corporations I will talk about shortly are facing litigation in a number of arenas in the United States, also in Essen, Germany, with Peruvian farmer against RWE, a constitutional case in the United States that's coming up to court next month in Oregon, several of municipal state-level cases in California, the state of Rhode Island, the city of Baltimore, other counties in the United States, including the investigations of 47 carbon majors by the Philippines Commission on Human Rights, and a number of other initiatives and investigations and litigation that imperil the industry and how they would like the future to roll for them. And possibly Wilmington, North Carolina, with a recent hurricane having hit North Carolina. Many of you have kept up with this. You'll see Miles Allen's footprints all over these publications here from his early work on liability for climate change and Nature in 2003 on the top left. Inside Climate News, Exxon, The Road Not Taken, a number of other seminal publications, including Naomi Oreskes', my co-founder of Climate Accountability Institute, with her 2010 book. And you see here Edward Teller pointing at the blackboard and having described the future of fossil fuel use and the likely impacts to the American Chemical Society as early as 1957, and again for the American Petroleum Institute and industry leaders in 1959, as Ben Frenta, I think, is probably talking about right now in the other forum. And investigations of what Shell knew and what Exxon knew decades previous to now. So why look at corporations? Well, because they are the entities that have produced the lion's share of emissions, if you trace the emissions from their product as well as their operational emissions to them. They have been aware of the threat of climate change to their business model since at least the 60s, as demonstrated by some of the publications I just showed. And they have consistently misled consumers, investors, and legislators about climate risk, or hidden behind willful ignorance about stating those risks. And I might add, those corporations have the technical skills, the capital, the innovation, and the moral responsibility, in my view, to reduce net carbon production in line with science-based targets below 2 degrees C. Here you see some of the images of the logos of those corporations. So we undertook a project about 12 years ago now, starting with the historical emissions based on one company, from Standard Oil in 1882 to 2002 as ExxonMobil, and then expanded that project to include 50 investor-owned companies, 31 state-owned entities, 9 government-run producers and ministries in countries that didn't have enough corporate data to substantiate corporate contributions. And of all of those, 36 were coal producers, 54 petroleum and natural gas, and 7 cement companies from their calcination of limestone. We took the earliest records possible in public libraries around the world. We had lots of interns and colleagues sending us information and original data from the corporations that supplied annual reports to the SEC and Form 10Ks, et cetera, because we wanted to use their production data. And in order to convert that production into emissions by their downstream consumers, we recognize emissions factors. We use data, 1 million barrels of oil and tons of coal, for example. We accounted for mergers and acquisitions, and we deducted for non-energy uses of particularly petroleum, which is around 8% for oil. And we both used, included Scope 1 and indirect Scope 3 product-related emissions. And by the way, we used conservative factors just so the industry wouldn't be able to come back to us and say, well, you exaggerated these claims about our contribution to atmospheric CO2. So we're conservative in every regard. So here's one of the original worksheets on a simple coal company called Peabody from 1945 onwards. The green column will be their total production of coal. And the other columns would designate what rank of coal is included so that we could actually compute the carbon content of each ton as combusted. So Peabody totaled 6.5 billion tons of coal production over its recent history. A more complicated one, since we included mergers and acquisitions, would be the current Chevron company, having absorbed Texaco, Getty, Gulf, Skelly, et cetera, over its corporate history. And that's over 100 billion barrels of oil over its history, and 164 trillion trillion cubic feet of natural gas. So if you aggregate the traced emissions to the 90 carbon majors and compare it to global industrial emissions in black, then we have the 90 carbon majors pretty well tracking that through 2015 to the 90 carbon majors in red. So I just finished an update with colleagues at the Union of Concerned Scientists for a paper we're coming out later this year. And I've just ranked the top 12 investor-owned and state-owned corporations here in terms of their percentage of global industrial emissions since 1750 through 2015. So the largest, having just surpassed Chevron, is Saudi Aramco at 3.33% of total global emissions over that history. And going down to the lowest one here, Petroleum de Venezuela. But as we know, the fortunes of multinationals have shifted over recent history. Chevron in blue here, for example, had a high rate of production and therefore emissions in the 1960s before the rise of OPEC and the establishment of national oil companies that we include as state-owned oil companies. So we see Gazprom in brown, for example, and Saudi Aramco in yellow here. So if we focus then, since this is the focus of litigation, on just the top 12 investor-owned companies, then they were topped here by Chevron, and going down the list, you can read yourself, and ending up at the 12th position being RW in Germany at 0.41%. And if we track those dozen companies from 1960 through 2015 in red, compared to, again, global industrial CO2 and CO2 emissions. In simple terms, where we are aiming to end up is to assign as a leverage point potential liability for climate change and climate damages to these corporations. That's why we've quantified each of these companies' contributions to climate change, starting with my own work published in 2014, tracing those emissions to the major carbon producers, and then with Brenda Eckwersel and Miles Allen and Peter Fromhoff here today, having modeled and attributed the rise in global atmospheric CO2 and surface temperature rise and sea level rise to those 90 carbon majors. And we have yet to then think about and evolve plans for how to allocate the burden of helping to fix the problem as well as contributing to the damages by the corporations themselves. So I just want to close with this quote from Henry Shue at Oxford, who accompanied our article last year in Climate Change with his observation that investor-owned companies have long understood the harm of their products, yet carried out a decades-long campaign to sow doubts about those harms in order to ensure fossil fuels will remain central to global energy production. Companies knowingly violated the most basic moral principle of do no harm, and now they must remedy the harm they have caused. And I agree, and thank you.
Okay, I think, let me start my clock here. Our presentation's gonna change things up a little bit and zoom out and look at the pressure that's been applied very successfully over the last 10 years to fossil fuel companies, and hopefully it'll be an interesting mirror. This is a paper I did with a co-author that's here today, Angela Carter, as well as Chuzo Dorati, who's our finance co-author. So if you have some financial detail questions, don't ask me. You've got other experts here. So yeah, we're going to talk about finance and politics, the way that these ideas that we're talking about, 2 degrees, carbon budgets, why have they been powerful in both those areas? And hopefully there'll be some interesting insight there. I'll go through that idea. We'll go individually through some of the grassroots politics and the finance, and then just finish with a few points. So basically, why is this frame powerful? Why does it help us drive a new paradigm and challenge the old paradigm? Obviously, it's because it's the official target. It's something that we can say you all agreed to. It's also really simple, which is probably why it was chosen. As everyone's been talking about, it exposes the contradictions. You can't have burn all these fossil fuels and keep them in the ground. You've got to choose one or the other. And I think the one that maybe is the main contribution of our paper is to highlight this third sort of lock-in dynamic where by changing people's expectations or beliefs about the future, people look around at other people and say, oh, if they're going somewhere else, maybe I have to change my plans. And this is known from technological lock-in that was analyzed a long time ago. You'll probably know the example, if you're old enough, of VHS versus beta, VCR. Right? When people look around and say, oh, the stores are only selling VHS, I'm not going to buy a beta machine. And this is what we're trying, I think, to do to investors and to do to politicians, to send a message to get the agnostics, people who maybe don't care about climate change, to make some of those changes. And that has a reinforcing effect. When a big actor does that, they convince other people. So I think when we're talking about this paradigm of cumulative emissions, that's worth comparing to the historical paradigm on demand. It's emissions reductions, and it's kind of what we did successfully, more or less, with pollution in the 60s. So just we go over the paper, just a brief history. Organizations here like SEI made a big difference in promoting this. Yeah, so it's something that's definitely become mainstream, obviously, and I guess to beat a dead horse, a slightly different take on this contradiction. So this is updating a figure that Peter Fromhoff and colleagues had in a paper a number of years back, and thank you, Peter, for sharing the data. So I'll have an update on this. This is the company's, going to be the company's projections of what they say emissions are going to be compared to the carbon crunch. So that's just looking at emissions pathways. As you go forward in time, they get steeper, and the contradiction increases and becomes amplified. And as we can see, whether it's Exxon, BP, or Shell, these are diverging paths. You can't plan on both these things as far as investments and political decisions. You've got to make a choice. And like I said, that's been covered well. So we used this sort of taxonomy from Ansar and colleagues they looked at divestment, and we sort of expanded it. 3 waves. So we've got early proponents, then you have someone in the mainstream that's early in the mainstream, a validator, and then once you have mainstream actors pick these ideas up and do things with them, that's something where we can start seeing big impacts. So across these 2 areas, like pretty much others have said, of the paper that analyze what the reserves are, the carbon bubble, and we'll just go through exactly how much that influenced actors and shaped their strategies, which was enlightening for us to learn. And of course, when we're talking about these different impacts, like I said, they're either taking assumptions that used to be really obvious and unquestioned and questioning them, or they're sort of generating new paradigm of thinking about things. Okay, so I'll go through a couple of the politics questions. And the paper is posted on the website, so I'm not going to go through the details of the timeline and focus more on the ideas behind it. So this is a quote from Naomi Klein in reaction to the carbon bubble idea. If we're the bubble, how do we flip it? How do we turn them into the bubble that's going to burst? So to her and Bill McKibben, she's describing her conversation with Bill McKibben where they decided to back divestment, where he decided to write that article in Rolling Stones. And what this basically means is it's not a credible idea. And someone was asking this, I think, in the last session. They didn't find it credible. These things will be burned. We're the ones that are going to get stranded. Humanity, not these fossil fuels. How do you make the carbon bubble a reality? How do you make people believe? And that's sort of that self-consciousness of those expectations. So she literally said, this explains to us why we should do divestment. It shows that it's us or them. Fossil fuels are enemies. So 2 degrees, and that theme of enemies was what was in Bill McKibben's article, and then they brought that "keep it in the ground" slogan to the climate march. And one of the things, both for divestment and that they described, was how surprised they were by the reaction that people had. How many people came up to that auditorium and said, "We're onto something here. This is something simple that people can understand." Divestment grew quite quickly. Same with the Keystone, like Michael was saying in the introduction. Obama, when you go from fringe to 5 years, the president of the U.S. is saying it. That's mainstream. Yeah, so I'll go forward from that. Okay, so broke finance up into disclosure and discourse. So talk, information, and financial actions. Again, Mark Carney in his speech to Lloyd's about again, sort of endorsing the carbon bubble, or at least bringing it up. Similarly, saying disclosure will help smooth adjustments and avoid a Minsky moment, which is like a rush to the exit where everyone goes, oh, maybe this stuff really isn't going to get burned. And then people start leaving, and then everyone else looks around, oh, we better leave too. And that's, again, that self-consciousness of this dynamic where people are looking around to each other and saying, well, how many people are betting on this future? So yeah, we had, there's article by Nicholas Stern in Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, Al Gore wrote, and these were some of the things that were credited by folks at Carbon Tracker popularizing their ideas, along with what was happening to coal and oil at the time. And again, sort of acknowledging these ideas, all the official reports, official agencies, every investment bank put out some sort of note, whether they were disagreeing, agreeing, everyone had to comment on this. And then, of course, disclosure, there's different tools that came out, and the shareholder resolutions against Shell and BP before climate got them to say they were going to look at 2 degrees, and those efforts really focused on, when you look at sort of the documents that were put to back that, it was 2 degrees, carbon budget. So really, this is one of the things that's structuring, again, just like in the politics, structuring some of the strategy and the rhetoric to go after this stuff. Okay, so in terms of that disclosure, the 2018 projections from these oil companies were included in the reports that supposedly explained how they were dealing with 2 degrees, and we heard how they're not. My point here is just that they're forced to deal with this frame. They rather talk about emissions reductions, but they're forced to relate to 2 degrees now in some way, and I think that's much better ground for us. Exxon didn't really change anything. And BP and Shell did some more to, they're not still anywhere near where they need to be, but they're having to relate to this frame, and that's a good place for us to be and not a good place from them strategically, I would say. Okay, so financial actions aren't as much, weren't as much backed by this idea of 2 degrees, by the idea of Paris. It's more the markets and just making financial decisions, but nevertheless, they're reinforcing when it gets called divestment. That's something that has a strong effect. So in that line, investments, so divesting, coal, Paris, it was like 2.6 trillion was divested or announced to be divested at that point. 2.1 trillion of that was just coal. So this is looking at an industry in decline and saying, well, it doesn't really hurt to get out. It's grown since then in scale as well as in targeting oil. Lenders are now making requirements, both private and sort of multilaterals, saying we're not going to lend to coal, heavy oil, things like that. And we're seeing the same thing for investment. Again, targeting the more expensive and more controversial sources. And each of these, it's like almost $1 trillion. I think this is 350 billion. So these are really big numbers. Okay, so in the paper, it's all together. If you want to sort of look at that, half our timeline isn't on there. There just wasn't room. If you think, hey, there's something that should be on there that isn't on there, be interested to hear about that. Okay, so one of the things that we took away from this was that there hasn't been a lot thought about the synergies between the financial and political pressures. So for example, with divestment, if a church divests because it's moral, they still have to do their due diligence. They don't want anyone to sue them. That has produced financial credibility. When a giant insurance company divests, that makes big news and it validates divestment. A similar thing with pipelines. Protests raise risk for investors. Investors are slower to commit, for example, to the Trans-Canada pipeline. That creates more time to build the movement. So maybe this is something that's worth exploring and that this reflection can help with. Okay, so it's talking about lock-in and sort of nonlinear tipping point dynamics. And that's one of the things that I think is worth doing is thinking about this in a bigger context of clean energy technology, of politics of inequity, and what's happening to democracies around the world. Just one small example of that, when we're thinking about the tipping dynamics, the different impact of these different pressures on coal versus oil. Coal having a stronger competition from renewables as well as gas, and being sort of the transitions further along. We've seen a lot of actions, validating actions by big players take place for that sooner. That raises a question of maybe it's important to have actions that bring peak demand for oil sooner, and maybe as well to think about what will change when that does come. Will the pressure be a lot stronger? And I'll leave it there because I know I'm over. Okay, thank you.
Okay, many thanks to all presenters for being on time or almost on time. We have around 15 minutes for Q&As. And I suggest we take 3 questions and then distribute them among the panelists.
Hi, this is Asia from the OECD. I thank you very much for the information. I think it's very nice to see to what extent investment is stranded and to what extent financial markets are starting to take that into account. But I was wondering whether there is in fact data or at least information on to what extent we see share prices for these companies or any financial outcomes from these companies being impacted by whether the discourse changing around stranded asset risk. And, because this is quite recent and I still may not have seen so much being done to see, are these companies paying for it or not, or through higher interest rates or whatever. So yeah, it would be nice to hear from you, from the panel on this. Thank you.
There is one question here. Third row.
Thank you. Simon Pirani, Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. My questions, thank you all for really interesting presentations. My questions to Greg. You're basically saying that there's an enormous amount of massaging of figures being done both by the IEA and by the IPCC. And the thing particularly with negative emissions, I was at a seminar recently in London with basically climate science people who are feeding into Working Group 3, and among them it's an open scandal that these negative emissions numbers are being used in this way. Is the more that people, such as the people in this room, academics, people in NGOs and so on, should be doing to unmask and obstruct this type of massaging of figures?
Hi, Sheila Whitley, the Overseas Development Institute. Thanks for a great panel. This is a question for Richard Heede, although others might want to pipe up as well. Thank you so much. It's great to see the work on carbon majors presented here. And I think the work that you and others are doing, focused on damages and litigation and investor-owned companies is really, really critical. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on strategies around the state-owned enterprises in the group, considering they make up, I think, at least half of the top 20. Who's working on it, thoughts you have on that. I'm going to make a pitch for tomorrow. We have a panel on the role of national oil companies, so maybe we can carry that conversation on there, but it would be great to hear more about state-owned enterprises because they kind of get jumped over a lot in the space.
Okay, thank you. So we have targeted questions for Greg and Rick, and a question on financial results. Impacts, Andrew, probably it goes down your way.
Yeah, sure, I can answer that briefly. So the short answer from me is I haven't seen any analysis that specifically links share prices to change in a discourse. I think the reason for that is probably there are so many other confounding factors. If you think that this sort of chat has really sort of picked up over the last couple of years, when of course there's been such huge volatility in commodity markets. Now that might not necessarily be a coincidence. It might be that divestment arguments, for example, have had better sway because the oil sector has already been in a bit of a hole, for example, and campaigners have been able to point to that. I think really the only advice I can only suggestion I can give on penalties is probably anecdotal. We've of course seen in coal, it's a lot of companies or a lot of financial institutions ceasing to offer financing for particular projects. Lesser degree in oil and gas, but it is happening, particularly with some of the European institutions. But one thing that sticks with me in terms of evidence is I went to CERAWeek, which is an oil and gas industry get together in Houston every year. And I think it was CEO of Enbridge, a pipeline company, back then did say that, you know, to an audience of oil and gas people, that they were experiencing a higher, or they thought they were experiencing a higher cost of capital before, due to these campaigns. So circumstantial evidence at best, but I'll take it.
I appreciate the question on state-owned oil and gas companies in particular. I think that's an enormous and difficult situation with their reserves vastly outnumbering the reserves of multinational corporations. Saudi Aramco, if I remember right, and I should because I wrote a paper on it some years ago, I think their reserves are around 300 billion barrels of oil. And compare that to Equinor, their reserves are about 5 billion barrels. They're both state-owned. I count them as state-owned because the majority of owners of the owner is the state itself, even though Statoil is some 33% owned by individual shareholders. But I wanted to address something else too, and that is the other aspects of corporations. Like all these companies have to borrow a lot of capital, and the insurance issue and the rate of loans for risky assets is going to increase over time. And I think there's a shadow liability in terms of retired asset obligations that are waiting for shareholders to realize what the scale is of the liabilities of oil and gas companies for their producing assets that will have to be responsibly retired. It costs a lot of money to do that, and that's barely even shown on the books.
On Simon's question about massaging figures, there are certainly those who massage figures, in particular in the fossil fuel companies. My view is that the massages are a response to stress tests. But so if you take, say, the Shell Sky scenario, I don't think you could treat that as anything other than a massage. I wouldn't level the same accusation at many of the climate scientists. There have been a number of interesting studies or interesting commentaries lately about the psychology both of a climate researcher who's perhaps spent 3 decades trying to articulate something and seen relatively little progress and is still trying to articulate that things can be done, and also studies of the psychology or commentaries on the psychology of Does it help to say it's still possible if you do this, or to be less gloomy about it, or does it hinder? On negative emissions specifically, it's something that came into the majority of the integrated assessment models around 10 or so years ago, related to the structure of how those models work. It made it possible to have a reduction in emissions that didn't look too scary. And so by the 5th assessment report a few years ago, it was in the vast majority of them. However, what I would point out is that this is a very active debate in the modeling community right now. There have been a number of critiques, I would say, over the last 2 years of the heavy reliance on negative emissions. A number of the scientists are saying, this is just ridiculous, we can't stand by this. And in the papers leading up to the IPCC special report in a couple of weeks, there are a couple of 1.5 degree scenarios that don't rely on negative emissions, or one that doesn't at all, and one that doesn't significantly. So I think this is a thing that is shifting. So I do see massage in the oil companies scenarios. I don't generally see it in most of the IPCC scenarios. In relation to the IEA, I mean, I find it very interesting that in 2016, if you read the World Energy Outlook, it's very critical of negative emissions. It says we don't think this is possible. And then 1 year later, they have a World Energy Outlook that relies almost entirely on what they said they don't think is possible. Now, whether that's a massage or whether that's something else, I'd love to know.
If I may, just in defense of climate scientists, and maybe I didn't ask my question clearly enough. I'm not a climate scientist, but I was in the seminar with climate scientists. Sorry, I was in the seminar with climate scientists who were precisely those people who were saying, as you said, this is ridiculous, when they looked at the top level figures and the way that the scenarios were being made to add up, which was in defiance rather than in keeping with the evidence that they had themselves been providing. Just to clarify, thank you.
One of the, I think one of the lessons of being so successful in this frame and what we've been able to push with it is that now we're in a period where the co-option of it is going to increase, and the oil companies have tremendous resources and power to make this frame work for them as much as they can. We're seeing that in the way that they're doing the sky scenario and trying to say this is 2 degrees, and that's without putting an answer out there. That's something that we have to contend with, I think.
If I could just add something as well on CCS, on the modelling point of view, there is a reason why it's in there, justified or not, and that's of course it's the cumulative amount of carbon in the atmosphere that drives warming. Ultimately, that's the whole idea of a carbon budget. There's a finite limit to what you can put out there. If you're still adding to it, then the temperature is still increasing. Whether you want stabilised temperature at 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees, 5 degrees. At some point, you have to get to net zero at some point. The product of that is that in the models, if there are some sectors that you can't decarbonise, like, let's say, some industrial processes, then that means you have to balance it out some other way, which is where CCS comes in. So, yeah, CCS looks challenging, and certainly on the scale that is in the models. But if we're not going to have CCS, then we need to find some other way of decarbonising those difficult to decarbonise scenarios. In many ways, it's a measure of the difficult job that we've left ourselves still.
In fact, I think we need to go beyond net zero by a certain date. We need to reduce concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. So we have like 3 minutes to wrap up. I'd like to ask if anyone has a question or comment on any big elephants missing, because we're trying to connect the dots. And I just can say that one elephant missing from my perspective, Yonatan, it's probably for your timeline, is that divestment works, social campaigns work, but then companies demand subsidies to support them, and sometimes governments bail them out because they're too big to fail. And unfortunately, that happened in Canada with the pipeline, because divestment really worked and social movements worked. So any thoughts from anyone else on big elephants? Kiel.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Ivetta. I'm Kiel Kühner with Leave It in the Ground initiative Lingo. A big elephant are central banks. So I think we all know we need to speed up the transition to 100% clean energy and then get going with removing carbon. How do we do that? Well, the fossil fuel industry is sitting on the brakes all the time. And I think the central banks have the power and the resources to take them out of that place. There is a proposal by the World Future Council for a climate bailout, where stranded assets would be packaged, bought up by the central banks, and the cash could only be used for investments in new renewables. And the European Central Bank is now stopping their quantitative easing program. They're injecting 30 billion euros into the economy every month. So just keeping that going for 3 years would be enough to buy up basically the fossil fuel industry in the United States. So quantitative easing is quite a specialist topic. Actually, I would like to ask who has heard about quantitative easing before?
So I'm afraid we have to take this conversation to the coffee break because we've run out of our allocated budget. But I thank everyone, the presenters for wonderful presentations and the audience for being so participative. Thank you.